What's up, everybody? I'm feeling particularly spry this morning, and I don't know why, because my Garmin watch that I wear primarily for running, even though I haven't run for something like 7 or 8 months owing to an Achilles tendon injury, my Garmin watch says that I woke up only 50% charged. Garmin has something called a body battery that tells you how much energy you have left in your energy reserves. You should wake up with anything from 90 to 100%. For some reason, I was barely recharged overnight, only getting 50%, and yet I feel particularly spry and excited. Is it because of a cup of coffee I had this morning? I don't know if that's it. I also watched a couple clips before making this video, and one of them was a sort of an entertaining clip of Charlie Kirk, who evidently just over a week ago did a tour in England, going to Cambridge University among the many sites that he visited, and engaging in a debate at the Cambridge Union with at least one student and a couple professors. Okay, it looked like there was this rotation of people taking turns coming up to the podium to challenge Charlie. And as I'm watching this debate at Cambridge Union, and I've watched many debates on YouTube, they have their own channel, the Cambridge Union channel. So does the Oxford Union. These are two of the most famous debate clubs in the world. And I've watched many of their debates on all sorts of issues, especially the Israel issue, not just the current war between Israel and Hamas, but already for several years they've had many debates about Israel and whether the country even has a right to exist. And I'm always amazed at just how far gone England appears to be as a country. And this was Charlie's conclusion as he returned to the United States. And I may include at the bottom of my own video, beneath the link to my coffee link, that page that you go to support me with cups of coffee. I may add as a link below that this clip. It's only about 10 minutes long of Charlie at Cambridge University. It's worth seeing. It's entertaining. And it may be one of the reasons why I have some extra step this morning, because I just watched what looked like an exciting fight, and I'm charged. Now, Steve, you just said that England is a country that seems to be long gone based on your observations of their debates, at their leading universities. But it's more than that. Just a couple days ago, I listened to somebody who works in England's, or maybe a retired person from England's security establishment, because I'm not sure he would be free to speak as freely as he did on this podcast that I was watching. But this former member of MI5, their version of the FBI, I believe. Okay, they have MI6, which is their version of the CIA, and MI5, which is their version of the FBI. And I know there's a few of you from England watching, so correct me if I'm wrong, but this former member of MI5, or maybe it's Scotland Yard, was explaining how England currently has 40,000 people on their terror watch list living within England. Now, the overwhelming number of these 40,000 people on their terror watch list are jihadis. And he's explaining how that current list of 40,000 terrorists, or at least people on the terror watch list, already exceeds the size of Hamas on October 7, when Hamas invaded Israel. That 40,000 already exceeds the size of the ISIS army in Iraq and Syria several years ago, when America formed a coalition to fight them. And that 40,000 formally comprises something like a third to a half of the present day number of the British Army. That's currently what's going on in England. So as I'm coming across these statistics, I'm just absolutely floored. I'm shocked. And lastly, I think it was Charlie who mentioned that there's a woman in England who has been sentenced to 2.5 years in prison for a tweet in which she simply said she doesn't think England should take in any more immigrants. For that tweet for which she is supposedly apologized and deleted shortly thereafter, she's about to do or has begun to serve a 2.5-year prison sentence. And I've seen many clips of video on X of similar things, of the British police knocking on people's door to arrest them over something they posted on social media that goes against the British government's policy, okay, concerning immigration to that country, or coming out against the Islamic fundamentalists who boisterously every week, I think it's on Saturday in London, come out not only against Israel, which is their right, of course, but many of them waving flags of ISIS and Al Qaeda. And it's not them who are being arrested for their free speech, but rather people that are opposing them being arrested for simply tweeting their disagreeing with these Muslim fundamentalists. And some of them, like this woman, doing jail time. Well, folks, I know that has nothing to do with today's episode, but I just felt it was worth mentioning. And maybe in a couple episodes in the future, I'll take on some of these newsworthy events. What's happening across the Anglosphere, the English-speaking world that most of us belong to. By Anglosphere, I'm really referring not just to the countries of the British Commonwealth, which include Canada and New Zealand, but also, and Australia, but also the United States. It was in England that the whole concept of freedom of speech was forwarded and submitted and founded. Okay, it's the bedrock of our American Bill of Rights. Okay, I would say that, and our unique Second Amendment, unique, of course, compared to the rest of the English-speaking world. Okay, and it's maybe worth taking up that subject as an episode in the future. But today's episode, we're continuing in our series, Making Sense of the End Times. You may recall that originally I wanted to focus on Matthew 24, but I realized when I studied the chapter that I'm not really doing justice to it unless I've discussed the chapters that frame it. And I began to do so in last week's episode when we began Matthew 21. I covered much of the chapter, but I left one part of it undone to pick up as a subject in its own right today, that being the parable of the tenants. And the reason why I want to cover this particular parable is because it is cited and used by many on the replacement theology side of the Israel debate to say, look, here it is, replacement theology. For Jesus is saying in the parable of the tenants of Matthew 21 that the vineyard, which is Israel, is being given to a different people. Okay, it's being taken from the tenants, the Jews, and being given now to the Gentiles. And therefore, this parable of the tenants, in their view, is establishing replacement theology. And therefore, I want to take on the parable of the tenants and tell you at least my interpretation of it, and my interpretation of the Bible, or at least this particular parable. Okay, again, the parable of the tenants is possibly something that you've never heard before. It may be an angle that you've never heard before from either your own pastors or, others who you follow on social media or on YouTube. So, to pick up this topic of the parable of the tenants in the book of Matthew chapter 21, I need to begin in Isaiah, where this whole theme of the vineyard has its genesis or its origins. Okay, so we're going to go to Isaiah chapter 5 for the beginnings of this whole vineyard symbolism. Okay, because it's in it that will more readily identify who the vineyard and tenants are in Matthew. Okay, so picking things up here in Isaiah chapter 5, verse 1. Let me sing for my beloved, my love song concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He dug it and cleared it of stones and planted it with choice vines. He built a watchtower in the midst of it and hewed out a wine vat in it. And he looked for it to yield grapes, but it yielded wild grapes. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it? When I looked for it to yield grapes, why did it yield wild grapes? Or it could read sour grapes. And now I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it shall be devoured. I will break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down. I will make it a waste, it shall not be pruned or hoed, and briars and thorns shall grow up. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain upon it. Now, this is the key here. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are his pleasant planting. Again, I repeat this because this is going to be the key here to understanding the parable of the tenants of Matthew. Again, verse 7, for the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel and the men of Judah. That's who the vineyard is, the house of Israel, the people, okay? The house of Israel and the men of Judah who are his pleasant planting. And he looked for justice, but behold, bloodshed, for righteousness, but behold, an outcry. So here in Isaiah chapter 5, we're answering the all-important question of who the vineyard is, okay? Not the tenants, but the vineyard. The vineyard is the house of Israel and the people of Judah. And because of their sin, Isaiah is warning them on behalf of God, okay, he's speaking under the inspiration of the Spirit of God, is warning them that he's about to make that vineyard desolate, okay? He's about to order the clouds to not rain on the vineyard. He's about to knock down the hedge that protects it so that it can be invaded. And who would ultimately invade Israel? Not long after this was prophesied, none other than Assyria. Now, Assyria would conquer all of Israel, sending it into exile, those northern 10 tribes, and it would ravage most of Judah except for Jerusalem. If you remember the very famous story that takes place under King Hezekiah, when the king of Assyria comes against Jerusalem and fails to take it, okay? In fact, the entire Syrian army is struck dead that night by a plague that comes forth from God himself. But even though Assyria doesn't manage to destroy Jerusalem, it does ravage most of Judah. And of course, Jerusalem itself later would be ravaged and taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. So this is what Isaiah is prophesying. But what we get out of this, of course, is the all-important identity of who the vineyard is. The vineyard is not the land of Israel. The vineyard is referring to the Jewish people here, okay? Now, Isaiah continues to further this concept of the vineyard, okay, or the symbolism here of the vineyard later on in Isaiah chapter 27, which we're going to move on now to read that, to continue along the path here to develop, because all of this was a fully developed theme by the time Matthew takes up the same symbolism or the same subject of the vineyard. Okay, so now I'm picking things up in Isaiah 27 with verse 1, and this is a promise to restore the vineyard. Okay, so good news for the vineyard. And again, who's the vineyard? The Jewish people. Okay, in that day, the Lord with his hard and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and he will slay the dragon that is in the sea. Okay, and this is where it becomes really relevant to us, starting with verse 2. In that day, a pleasant vineyard, sing of it. I, the Lord, am its keeper. every moment I water it, lest anyone punish it. I keep it night and day. I have no wrath. Would that I had thorns and briars to battle. I would march against them. I would burn them up together, or let them lay hold of my protection. Let them make peace with me. Now here's the key. Okay, again, to understanding what will come in Matthew. In days to come, Jacob shall take root. Israel shall blossom and put forth roots and fill the whole world with fruit. Okay, and I'm going to skip down here to verse 12. In that day, from the river Euphrates to the brook of Egypt. Okay, these are the promised borders to Israel. Okay, they've never been fully fulfilled, but they will in the millennium. And it's basically saying that right now. In that day, from the river Euphrates to the brook of Egypt, the Lord will thresh out the grain, and you will be gleaned one by one, O people of Israel. And in that day, a great trumpet will be blown, and those who were lost in the land of Assyria and those who were driven out to the land of Egypt will come and worship the Lord on the holy mountain at Jerusalem. Okay, so very importantly, what we just read in Isaiah chapter 27 promises the restoration of that vineyard. Again, who's the vineyard? The Jewish people who have been disciplined. And here it's mentioned, okay, that they were sent into exile to be disciplined, but ultimately will be brought back, rerooted in the land, and the fruit thereof will be spreading around the entire world. Very reminiscent of a verse in the New Testament from Romans 11, and I'm just going to turn aside here to my computer to read it to you. For if there, okay, and there's the Jews, okay, for if their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? Okay, so here being inferred in Isaiah, what Paul says outright in the book of Romans chapter 11, that when the Jewish people are finally reconciled to Jesus, it will be exponentially greater, a life-giving force to the world than the rejection of Jesus has for the Gentiles for the past 2,000 years, okay? In other words, Jewish rejection of Jesus led to the Gentiles being saved and brought much life to the world in a sense, but how much more so when the Jewish people themselves are saved and regrafted back into our own tree, okay? Inferred here as well in Isaiah chapter 27. Couldn't be any clearer, and it's with this basis, folks, that we're now going to move to the controversy of the parable of the tenants in Matthew chapter 21. Let's go right to it. Picking it up here from verse 33. Hear another parable. Okay, this is Jesus speaking, of course. Hear another parable. There was a master of a house who planted a vineyard and put a fence around it and dug a winepress in it and built a tower and leased it to tenants. Now we have a new factor, a new element or new character, if you will, in this parable of the vineyard. Before, what we read in Isaiah only spoke of a vineyard, the vineyard being the Jewish people, but now we're being introduced to a new character, not just the vineyard, but now tenants, okay? Tenants that God is charged to work in the vineyard. And now we have to arrive to some sort of conclusion as to who these workers or tenants are in the vineyard. When the season for fruit drew near, he sent his servants to the tenants to get his fruit. And the tenants took his servants and beat one, killed another, and stoned another. Again, he sent other servants, more than the first, and they did the same to them. Finally, he sent his son to them, saying, "They will respect my son." But when the tenants saw the son, they said to themselves, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and have his inheritance." And they took him and threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. When therefore the owner of the vineyard comes, again, the vineyard being the Jewish people. So when the owner of the Jewish people comes, what will he do to the tenants? Okay, the tenants are not the vineyard itself. Again, it's a separate and new character being introduced. And in a minute, we're going to find out exactly who the tenants are. So, therefore, when the owner comes, what is he going to do to the tenants? And they said to him, he will put those wretches to a miserable death and let out the vineyard to other tenants who will give him the fruits in their seasons. Jesus said to them, have you never read in the scriptures, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone? This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in his eyes. All right, and now comes the verse that all the replacement theologists exploit to try to push their point, okay, that Israel has been given to a different ethnic group. Okay, replacement theology, or a different community, this being the church. Okay, here we go, verse 43. Therefore, I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you. And the replacement theologists would say that the you are the Jews, the vineyard, and given to a people producing its fruits. And the one who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces. And when it falls on anyone, it will crush him. Verse 45, when the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, they perceived that he was speaking about them. Bingo, okay? Who are the tenants who Jesus said are going to be replaced? Not the vineyard itself, the Jewish people, but the tenants working in the vineyard. And who are the tenants? Well, here it says outright, it's the chief priest and the Pharisees, for they perceived that he was speaking about them. And although they were seeking to arrest him, they feared the crowds because they, the Jewish people, the vineyard, held Jesus to be a prophet. Wow, wow, wow. Okay, this is very important. Who is the vineyard? The vineyard is the Jewish people, or ethnic Israel. Who are the tenants that Jesus is stating are going to be replaced? Not the vineyard, but rather the people that God entrusted the vineyard to, the leaders of the Jewish people in Jesus' generation, this being the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, and the temple establishment. They're the ones who are going to be replaced, not the vineyard, but the workers. And this, of course, is crucial because it debunks, first of all, the whole angle of replacement theology that it's the Jewish people or vineyard that's going to be replaced, but rather we're learning that it's simply the leaders of the Jewish people that God entrusted with his flock, the flock of Israel. They have failed in their mission to shepherd the flock of Yahweh, and therefore Jesus is saying that they're going to be replaced with someone else. Well, there's only two potential replacements that I can think of, and I'm going to cover both of them for the rest of the video. Okay, well, many people would argue it's the church. Okay, now I've just established that the church doesn't replace the Jewish people, the vineyard, but you could argue that the historic church replaced the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the teachers of the law as now the forebearers of the gospel, okay? That for the last 2,000 years, the work of the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God has been done primarily by the church, by taking the gospel to the four corners of the earth. And of course, that's a legitimate view, and of course, we could agree with that, okay? It's not the Jews as missionaries that have taken the gospel to the four winds of the earth, but rather the Gentile church. But has the Gentile church been better custodians of taking care of the Jewish people, okay, or being a witness of the truth to the Jewish people than the Pharisees or the Sadducees or the teachers of the law? And unfortunately, the answer, folks, for anybody that knows the history of the church and the Jews, the answer is no. Okay, the history of the church's relation to the Jews is abysmal and has only begun to change since the Holocaust and the rebirth of Israel. Now, several of you keep in touch with me via the site that I refer to at the end of each of my videos, Ko-fi. Okay, it's the site that you're able to support me on, but it's also through that site that many of you have reached out to me with comments and with questions. Okay, for those of you who don't put those comments on the YouTube videos themselves in the comment section, several of you have reached out to me via Ko-fi. And one of you, who I won't mention by name, has had a ongoing discussion with me already for months. And I recommended to him to read this book, okay, because it just came up, the whole issue of church anti-Semitism. And I highly recommended to him this multi-volume set of very well-written books. It's called, and I sort of regret it's called by the name, but it's called by the name, The History of Anti-Semitism, okay? Now, why do I regret that it's called The History of Anti-Semitism? Because the name sort of would allude to some sort of boring academic, work that just lists, chronologically and in a boring way, the history of anti-Semitism in a dry presentation. But this is the furthest thing from the truth. This is a very well-written book in highly readable prose, all 4 volumes. And it's amazing. It was written by a guy named Leon Polyakov. Okay, again, I'll hold it up for you so that you can see it in case any of you want to look it up on Amazon. And I was amazed because the book was originally written in French. It's been translated to English, and each volume has been translated to English by a different translator, and yet each volume reads so well in English. Okay, that's so uncommon. So first of all, we have a book written by a scholar that's highly readable to begin with. Okay, that's the big shock, because a lot of academic writing is not highly readable, but this one is. And the fact that it's translated from a different language and still highly readable makes it fascinating. So I had recommended this series, particularly the first volume, because I had finished that first volume only a week before I had recommended it to this gentleman. He got it and he's loving it, okay, and he agreed with me that it's highly readable. But what's the point? As he is reading through the book, he says to me, Steve, I have no clue as to how any Jewish person could possibly be open-minded to the gospel, considering the egregious violations and violence and outright genocide that the historical church did to the Jews. And I'm not just referring to the ultimate climax of all this in World War II, okay, and I will argue, I won't do it in this video because of time, but I would say that replacement theology is what ultimately paved the way to Auschwitz, okay? Many scholars would agree with that statement, but of course I don't have a whole episode here to devote to it. It would probably take many episodes, and I'm just dropping that, okay? That you can't understand the suffering of the Jews in Europe without understanding the key role that the church played in demonizing the Jews and persecuting the Jews in Europe. And this multi-voluminous work that I highly recommend to those of you that have the time and interest to read about it, okay, well, is probably one of the best series ever written on the subject of the history of the church and the Jews. And I told that gentleman that I agreed with him and that I got saved in spite or despite that history. Okay, that's amazing. I got saved despite church history, okay? And I just want to tell you a little bit, and I mentioned this testimony of mine in last week's episode. I probably have mentioned bits and pieces of this testimony throughout the year on this YouTube channel, but I just want to mention the first bit of my testimony again to just show you how God meant for the church to become responsible custodians of the Jewish people. In other words, in God's intent when he replaced those Pharisees and Sadducees and teachers of the law with the church, how it should have worked out as opposed to how it did work out. So again, in this story, I went to school at Penn State, and my parents drive me to the school, to the university. It's in the center of Pennsylvania. It's beautiful. It's set in the mountains. I believe these mountains, called locally the Nittany Mountains, are part of the Appalachian Mountains. So it's just beautiful. Okay, the environment of Penn State. My mom goes with me to my dorm room, and my dad and my mom and me were bringing my clothing into the room, and my mom is dusting the room and helping me to arrange things, and in comes a senior classman by the name of Jamie. Jamie is what's called the RA, the resident advisor. The job of this senior classman is to enforce the discipline of the freshmen, particularly those of us that are under the age that it's legal to drink or to consume alcohol, to make sure we don't break that rule in the dorms, that we don't consume alcohol or, smoke pot and do all these other things that are illegal. That's their main job, okay? And Jamie walks into the room, and for some reason, out of nowhere, he says to me and my mom, "Are you people Jews?" Now, I don't know why he asked this, but that was the very first thing he asked after introducing himself by name. And I said to him, "Yeah, what is it to you? Why are you asking me this?" And Jamie responds by saying, "I want to thank you, the Jewish people, for what you've given to me, a Gentile, the Bible, the prophets, and Jesus the Messiah." Well, at that point, my mom drops all my clothes and says to my dad, whose name is Sheldon, "Sheldon, start up that car. We're out of here." And my mom and dad prematurely depart Penn State and now leave me alone for the first time in my life on campus with this guy who I thought was a nut job, Jamie. And I said to him, "Jamie, okay, now that you've chased my family away and they're driving back home, all right, now tell me who you are." And Jamie proceeds to tell me how he and his family are born-again Christians, formerly of the Catholic tradition. Now, of course, this was confusing to me because for those of us that are Jews, Catholic, Protestant, born again, Mormon even, okay, we see all those things as just one Christian world. So Jamie, of course, had to explain to me what that whole concept of being born again is. But the point of this whole story is with Jamie's opening salvo, saying, "I want to thank you, the Jewish people, for what you've given me, a Gentile, the Bible, the prophets, and Jesus the Messiah." Jamie, with that simple statement, disarmed an entire life of my knowing all the stuff in this book about Christian anti-Semitism and hatred for the Jews. Jamie totally disarmed that, totally reversed everything that had produced within me with his opening sentence, because I could no longer say that Christianity as an entirety hates the Jewish people, which is what I believed. I always knew that Jesus as a person was different from the Christians. In other words, when I would see movies as a kid around Easter time, particular, that Jesus movie about, Jesus's life and his crucifixion and all that, I always knew that Jesus was one of us. He was a Jew, and his followers referred to him as rabbi. But I never saw the fruit of any of this in the church or Christianity. In other words, I was drawn to Jesus as a kid, but repulsed by the church. But with this 5-minute meeting with Jamie, the RA, he totally disarmed all of that damage that had been done by Christian history. And with that discussion that lasted for only 5 minutes, Jamie planted the seeds that a couple months later would blossom into my being gloriously saved in my dorm room there at Penn State. Now, between that dialogue with Jamie and my getting saved a couple months later, I had met many wonderful Gentile Christians like Jamie who just simply compounded that positive witness and continued to do away with the damage that is the legacy of the stuff, again, in this book here, the history of anti-Semitism. So I got saved by a sequence of events that began with a Gentile and then several Gentiles after him fulfilling God's perfect will, his original purpose for these Gentile peoples, okay, the Gentile Christians who here in the parable the tenants are being prophesied that would at least temporarily replace the leaders of the Jews over the flock. Jamie and those that succeeded him there to witness to me at Penn State were faithful shepherds, at least to me. Now, would you believe that since I came to faith, since I got born again, since I had this encounter with Jesus at Penn State, almost every single Jewish person who I've met who's come to the same faith has done so by way of Gentile witnesses. In other words, I don't know a single Jewish person who's come to the faith in Jesus through a Jewish Messianic Jew. I'm not saying they don't exist, but I have never met one. Every single Jewish person who's come to the faith that I've met, and I've met many of these so-called Messianic Jews, and I'm just saying so-called because in the last episode, I had this discussion with you about the nomenclature. How did Jews who believe in Jesus even refer to themselves? Okay. I've met many such people, Messianic Jews, and I can tell you, I don't think I've met a single one who was brought to the faith by a Messianic Jew. Rather, we all came, or let's say the process by which we all came ultimately to the faith was through a positive Gentile witness. And Jamie didn't do so by beating me over the head with the Bible or beating me over the head with the shortcomings of the Jewish people and our blindness for the last 2,000 years. He did it simply by loving this Jewish person, okay? He showed me love, and that love within seconds disassembled all the negativity of church history of the last 2,000 years. Now, if you're patient, I want to just mention another witness because this is amazing. This has to do with a friend of mine named Phil, and I know that Phil is watching this. Phil is one of my most faithful watchers. Okay, he's the one who helped hatch this whole YouTube channel thing. Okay, encouraged me to do it several years ago. And Phil, I met many years ago, well over 20 years ago. He was sent to Israel by his church, a Calvary Chapel in Oregon, I believe, Applegate. Okay, his pastor John Corson sent him to Israel to be their roaming reporter. This was during the second Intifada. Okay, so Phil was there in Israel at a time of very low level of tourism, very few tourists. But his church and pastor, which is very committed to Israel and committed to the Jewish people, sent Phil as their roaming reporter. And I met Phil at a dinner one night, and we became very good friends. And I would serve as Phil's translator, knowing Hebrew. So whenever Phil would do interviews on the street or some members of the Israeli government who didn't know English, he would take me along to be his translator. Now, Phil is an important figure in this story because I had a neighbor who happened to be a paratrooper. I shared my courtyard in Jerusalem. There were two apartments, mine and one other, that shared a common courtyard together. Our two apartments were owned by the same landlord, and we were in the same gated area. Okay, the only two apartments that had access to our courtyard was our two apartments. And one of my neighbors, and I say one of them because this apartment had a constant rotation of people. I would only have a neighbor in this apartment for maybe half a year, and then they would be succeeded by a new person and then another person, because that apartment was extremely small and extremely hot, and none of these tenants were able to survive to the full extent of the 1-year contract. But anyway, so one of the neighbors or tenants in this rotation of tenants who were my neighbors was a paratrooper. And one day this paratrooper says to me out of nowhere, and I have no idea what made him say this to me, because I didn't bring this up. I never mentioned this to him, but he says to me, "Steve, are you one of these Messianic Jews?" So I'm totally caught off guard because, again, I never mentioned this to him, and I have no idea why he asked me this. And I said, "Well, yeah, I'm one of these Jews who had an encounter with Jesus." And he says, "Wow," he said, "that's really interesting." He said, "I had soldiers like you who served under me." And we continued to have some small talk on this theme, and then it came to an end, and he went back into his apartment, and he never wanted to pursue the subject with me again. In other words, it was the only time that neighbor and I ever discussed it. I happened to be a member of the rival unit to the paratroopers known as Golani. Okay, I served in what was called the Golani Infantry Brigade, whereas he was a paratrooper, and therefore we sort of had this army rivalry in common, at least. Okay, he respected me because I was in the Golani Brigade, but that was it. He never wanted to pursue this discussion with me again, as nice as he was about it. Okay, but it wasn't like he was interested in hearing any, about my testimony of how I came to have faith in Jesus. Then Phil, who I just mentioned from Applegate in Oregon, comes to my apartment, a month or two later for dinner. And while he's in the courtyard, that same neighbor comes out and he introduces himself to Phil. And he says to Phil, "Phil, what in the world are you doing here? There's a major terror wave. In fact, an unprecedented terror wave of buses blowing up and cafes being blown up and pizzerias being blown up, and no tourists are here. Phil, what are you doing here?" And Phil responds to this neighbor by saying, "My pastor in Oregon loves the Jewish people and sent me here. I too love the Jewish people and sent me here to be his eyes and ears of what's happening in Israel." And Phil just emphasized how he and his pastor love the Jews, love Israel. And this Jewish paratrooper neighbor of mine is stunned. And as I'm looking at his face, he even starts to tear up. I was absolutely floored by this, and he wanted to know more about this. He wanted to hear Phil's testimony. And as I'm watching all this, I'm like, gee, he wasn't interested in my testimony a couple months ago, but he's so drawn to Phil. And then I was reminded of a verse from Paul, again from the book of Romans, which I quoted just a few minutes ago elsewhere, but in that same grouping of chapters 9 through 11, when Paul says, "Salvation has gone from the Jew to the Gentile to cause the Jew to envy." In other words, God's original plan was for the Gentiles to get saved, but to act in such a way that it would cause us, the Jews, to envy. And unfortunately, the enemy here, the devil or Satan, knowing that was the dynamic that God commissioned, sabotaged it from the get-go, so that the relationship of the church to the Jews has been anything but one that would cause the Jews to envy. And that's a great tragedy. So going back to the parable of the tenants, who were probably the tenants that Jesus had in mind that would replace the Pharisees and Sadducees to be faithful shepherds? Well, in this case, he probably was hoping, per Paul echoing this hope 15 years later or so when he wrote the book of Romans, that the church would cause those same Jewish people, the Vineyard, to envy, but they did not. and therefore now we have a problem. The church historically has failed the Jewish people. Yes, there's been Jamies like my RA. Yes, there's been Phils who have witnessed to my neighbor there in Jerusalem. And yes, I know today there are thousands, if not a couple million Christians who have a phenomenal heart towards the Jewish people and are truly our best friends. But this is happening very late in the stage of the era that's coming to an end. In other words, this is all late stage phenomena for the end times is upon us. The end times are, sorry for the grammar there, the end times are upon us, and this is a late stage development. And yes, for all the Jamies and Phils, there are millions of Jews who have not been touched by a positive witness of the gospel, which means that therefore I got to take up the second character, the second candidate who Jesus had in mind is replacing the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the teachers of the law. And who is this candidate to fill the shoes of both the Jewish leaders and church leaders that have failed the Jewish people for the past 2,000 years to become the ultimate tenant of his vineyard, the Jewish people? Well, I don't think you'll be shocked when I say that that is none other than God himself. God himself is going to have to pick up the slack and is beginning to pick up the slack where both the Jewish and church leaders have failed. In other words, God himself, Yahweh, the God of Israel, through his intervention, his direct intervention in Jewish history, both in the days that we're living in now, as well as in the days of the future, especially in the events that we relate to that period of time known as the tribulation and, the Antichrist and the two witnesses and all that stuff. God himself has to pick up the slack where both the Jewish tenants and the Christian tenants failed his flock, the Jewish people. In this episode, we've covered the controversial parable of the tenants. Controversial because many people who subscribe to church replacement theology have referred to this parable as proof that God has replaced the Jewish people with the church. But in this episode, we learn it's the vineyard who's the Jewish people. That's the one constant. What's not constant is the character introduced by Matthew, not mentioned in Isaiah, that being the tenants. The tenants, we discovered, Jesus says outright in the parable, or actually Matthew in his commentary to the parable says that the tenants are the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, for they understood that Jesus was referring to them when he referred to the unfaithful tenants who beat his emissaries that came to get fruit from the vineyard and ultimately killed the owner's son. It's them who are to be replaced. Ultimately, God would have desired that the church and its leaders would have faithfully picked up the slack or picked up from where the Jewish leaders failed. But unfortunately, the Christian witness to the Jewish people for the last 2,000 years has been abysmal. It's been an anti-witness. But yet, per my witness and the story that I told about my friend Phil, there have been here and there faithful, loving Gentiles who love the Jews and have, despite church history, led some of us to the faith. The church age and end times are synonymous with one another, and we all agree, at least most of us who watch this channel, that we're at a late stage in those end times. And even though there's Jamies and there's Phils, it's so late in the game that none other than God himself ultimately has to become the tenant that shepherds his vineyard, Israel, to the truth and to that ultimate reconciliation with him and the Messiah that we've already covered in verses like that, which we've read in Zechariah chapters 12 through 14. So God himself is going to intervene, and he's begun to intervene in our day, but this continues to crescendo throughout that coming era known as the tribulation, and will climax when Jesus returns. And thus, as Paul says, in that day, all Israel will be saved. Well, folks, I hope that you enjoyed this episode. I enjoyed teaching it. If you want to bless me with a cup of coffee for my efforts, you can do so by visiting my Ko-fi link, which I put at the bottom of each video in the extended description to that video. I promised at the head of this video that I would also, below that link, add a link to this Charlie Kirk clip. It's only about a 10-minute clip of his debate at the Cambridge Union in England. It's so animated, but it just gives great insight to just how far fallen England is as a country in our own day. Anyway, have a good week, and I'll check in with you in next week's episode as we continue to frame Matthew chapter 24. Bye-bye.